Who the avoidant actually ends up with. It's not who you think. Somewhere right now there is someone replaying old conversations in their head, trying to solve a mystery that has refused to make sense for months, maybe even years. They are staring at a relationship that seemed deeper, stronger, more emotionally connected than the one that came after it, yet somehow they weren't the person the avoidant stayed with. They weren't the person the avoidant committed to. They weren't the person who got the ending everyone assumed was coming, and that question can haunt people. How does someone spend years loving an avoidant, understanding them, waiting for them, sacrificing for them, only to watch them build a future with someone else? The answer is uncomfortable because it forces us to question almost everything we assume about love. Most people think relationships are won by effort. They think the person who loves hardest eventually gets chosen. They think patience earns commitment. They think understanding earns loyalty. But when it comes to avoidance, the story often unfolds very differently. And if you've ever found yourself confused by who an avoidant eventually settles down with, stay with me because by the end of this video, you're going to understand something that most people never fully grasp. And while you're here, if you're fascinated by the psychology of avoidance, relationships, and the hidden emotional dynamics nobody talks about, hit subscribe. You might as well because chances are you've already spent far longer trying to understand an avoidant than you planned anyway. The shocking truth nobody talks about is that avoidants often do not end up with the person who loved them the most. In fact, many of the people who gave them the deepest devotion are left feeling completely blindsided by the final outcome. The common narrative tells us that love eventually wins, that persistence pays off, and that if you continue showing up for someone long enough, they will finally recognize your value. But avoidant attachment rarely follows that script. The more emotionally invested one person becomes, the more complicated the dynamic can grow. What begins as genuine love can slowly transform into a cycle where one person carries the emotional weight of the relationship while the other struggles with increasing pressure. The tragedy is that the loving partner often believes they are getting closer to the finish line when, in reality, they may be moving further away from what the avoidant actually needs. This is why so many people are shocked when the relationship ends. They look at everything they gave and cannot understand how it wasn't enough. But the truth is that the outcome was never determined by who loved more. It was determined by something far less obvious and far more psychological. That's why everyone predicts the wrong outcome. Friends see the empathic partner and assume they're the obvious choice. Family members watch years of dedication and assume commitment is inevitable. Even the avoidant may genuinely believe at one point that this is the person they will end up with. Yet relationships are not built solely on affection. They're built on emotional experiences, and what outsiders fail to see is the internal reality the avoidant is living with every day. While one person is measuring love by effort, sacrifice, and emotional investment, the avoidant is often measuring something entirely different. They're paying attention to how much pressure they feel, how much freedom they perceive they have, how emotionally responsible they feel for another person's happiness, and whether being close feels comforting or overwhelming. This creates a hidden disconnect. The relationship may look ideal from the outside while feeling increasingly difficult from the inside. As a result, everyone predicts the future based on visible signs while missing the invisible emotional currents that are quietly shaping the avoidance decisions. By the time the final outcome arrives, it seems shocking only because most people were looking at the wrong indicators from the beginning. And that leads directly to the person who usually doesn't win. In countless avoidant relationships, the most devoted partner becomes trapped in a painful paradox. The more they care, the harder they work. The harder they work, the more emotionally invested they become. And the more emotionally invested they become, the more they begin organizing their world around the relationship. Their thoughts revolve around it, their moods depend on it, their sense of security becomes tied to it. None of this happens because they're weak. It happens because they're human. They love deeply and naturally want closeness, but from the avoidance perspective, this growing dependence can feel frightening. Suddenly, every disagreement feels heavier. Every disappointment feels more significant. Every emotional need feels like a responsibility they aren't sure they can fulfill. The devoted partner believes they are proving their value, while the avoidant unconsciously experiences increasing pressure. That's why some of the most loving people end up feeling the most confused. They assumed their effort was creating safety when in many cases it was unintentionally creating anxiety. Not because love is wrong, but because love without emotional balance can become something an avoidant struggles to carry. So if it's not the person who loves the hardest who is the avoidant actually looking for, the answer surprises almost everyone. Beneath all the distance, all the independence, and all the emotional walls, avoidants are searching for something that feels incredibly rare: connection without captivity. They want closeness, but they don't want to feel consumed. They want love, but they don't want to feel trapped. They want commitment, but they don't want to feel like their identity disappears inside the relationship. Most avoidants would never explain it this way because many don't fully understand it themselves. They simply know when a relationship starts feeling heavy, they instinctively pull back. When it feels demanding, they retreat. When it feels like someone else's emotional survival depends on them, they become overwhelmed. What they're secretly searching for is a relationship where intimacy and freedom can coexist. A relationship where they can move closer without feeling swallowed. A relationship where love feels like an invitation rather than an obligation. And this is where many people begin to realize that the avoidant's final choice often has less to do with who loved them most and more to do with who made connection feel sustainable. Because in the end, the person an avoidant chooses is rarely the person who fought the hardest to keep them. More often, it's the person who understood something far more important: how to be close without making closeness feel like a burden. Once you understand that, another uncomfortable truth starts to emerge. Intense chemistry is not enough. In fact, some of the relationships that feel the most electric in the beginning are the very ones most likely to collapse under their own emotional weight. People often mistake intensity for compatibility. They mistake obsession for connection. They mistake emotional highs for emotional health. An avoidant can feel incredible chemistry with someone. They can think about them constantly. They can experience powerful attraction, excitement, anticipation, and even love. But chemistry doesn't solve the deeper problem. The real question is what happens after the excitement settles and everyday life begins. What happens when the relationship requires consistency instead of adrenaline? What happens when vulnerability becomes unavoidable? What happens when expectations start forming? This is where many intense relationships begin to unravel. The same connection that once felt irresistible can start feeling demanding. The same emotional closeness that felt exciting can begin feeling invasive. The avoidant isn't necessarily losing feelings. They are often reacting to the increasing psychological pressure that naturally comes with deeper attachment. This is why so many people are devastated when they hear phrases like, "I still care about you, but something feels off." They assume the avoidant has stopped loving them. Often the reality is more complicated. The avoidant may still feel deeply connected while simultaneously feeling trapped by the emotional intensity surrounding the relationship. And when those two experiences collide, distance often becomes their preferred solution. This is also why the fatal mistake most partners make is completely understandable. They see the avoidant pulling away, so they move closer. They notice less communication, so they send more messages. They feel uncertainty, so they seek reassurance. They sense emotional distance, so they increase emotional effort. From a logical standpoint, this makes perfect sense. Most healthy relationships improve through communication and connection, but with avoidance, increased pursuit can unintentionally amplify the exact fear driving the withdrawal. The avoidant begins feeling watched, managed, evaluated, or emotionally cornered. The pursuing partner becomes frustrated because they are trying harder than ever, yet getting worse results. What neither person realizes is that they have entered a cycle. One person seeks closeness to reduce anxiety, the other seeks distance to reduce anxiety. Both are attempting to feel safe, but their solutions directly conflict with each other. The more one pursues, the more the other retreats. The more the other retreats, the more the first person pursues. Eventually, the relationship becomes centered around managing fear rather than building connection. That's why effort alone cannot save these dynamics. Sometimes the very thing a person believes will repair the relationship is accidentally keeping the cycle alive. The tragedy isn't a lack of love. The tragedy is that both people are speaking completely different emotional languages while desperately trying to reach each other. What many people never stop to ask is what actually feels safe to an avoidant. Not exciting, not attractive, not impressive, safe, because safety is often the hidden variable behind lasting commitment. To understand this, imagine carrying an invisible belief that closeness eventually becomes overwhelming. Imagine believing that dependence leads to disappointment. Imagine learning consciously or unconsciously that emotional needs create pressure rather than connection. If those beliefs exist beneath the surface, then safety starts looking very different. Safety becomes someone who doesn't panic when space is needed, someone who doesn't interpret every moment of distance as rejection, Someone who can tolerate uncertainty without immediately escalating the situation. Someone who remains emotionally grounded even when the relationship experiences normal fluctuations. This doesn't mean the avoidant wants emotional coldness, quite the opposite. Avoidants are often deeply drawn to warmth, affection, and understanding, but they need those qualities delivered in a way that doesn't feel consuming. The person who feels safest is rarely the loudest lover in the room. They are often the calmest. They don't force intimacy. They allow it to develop naturally. They don't demand emotional performances. They create an environment where authenticity feels possible. And over time, that sense of safety becomes incredibly powerful because it reduces the avoidant's need to protect themselves. That brings us to something many people misunderstand completely: the magnetic pull of independence. When most people hear the word independence, they imagine emotional detachment. They imagine someone who doesn't care. But that's not what healthy independence means. Healthy independence means having a full identity outside the relationship. It means maintaining purpose, friendships, goals, passions, and self-respect regardless of relationship status. To an avoidant, this quality can feel incredibly attractive because it removes a hidden burden. They no longer feel responsible for being someone's entire emotional world. They no longer feel like every fluctuation in the relationship will create a crisis. They no longer feel trapped inside expectations they fear they cannot meet. Instead, they experience a partner who chooses connection rather than needing it for survival. That distinction changes everything. One dynamic feels heavy, the other feels free. One creates pressure, the other creates invitation. And here's the irony that many heartbroken people eventually discover. The version of themselves that an avoidant is most attracted to is often the version that existed before they became consumed by the relationship. The version that had dreams, confidence, boundaries, and a life of their own. Not because the avoidant doesn't want closeness, but because independence reassures them that closeness won't come at the cost of freedom. And perhaps nowhere is this difference more important than in understanding the gap between being wanted and being needed. At first glance, they sound similar. In reality, they create completely different emotional experiences. Being wanted feels flattering. It feels chosen. It feels mutual. Being needed, however, can feel heavy, especially for someone already uncomfortable with emotional responsibility. Many avoidants secretly fear becoming trapped in a role where they are expected to constantly regulate another person's emotions, provide endless reassurance, or carry the weight of someone else's self-worth. So when a relationship begins to feel less like two people walking side by side and more like one person leaning heavily on the other, alarms start going off internally. The avoidant may not even understand why they feel uncomfortable. They simply know they are starting to lose their sense of ease. This is why some avoidants eventually commit to someone who appears less emotionally invested than a previous partner. Observers assume the new relationship is less meaningful because it appears less intense. But intensity and health are not the same thing. Often what the avoidant experiences in that relationship is something they have been searching for all along. The feeling of being genuinely wanted without feeling emotionally responsible for another person's existence. And that distinction is far more important than most people realize because it quietly shapes who the avoidant feels capable of building a future with. Once you see that distinction, another mystery begins to make sense. One of the most confusing experiences people have after losing an avoidant is watching them commit to someone who seems calmer, quieter, or less emotionally intense than the relationship they had before. From the outside, it can look like the avoidant downgraded. It can look like they settled. It can even feel insulting to the person who invested years trying to make the relationship work. But what often goes unnoticed is the power of emotional consistency. Avoidants spend much of their lives navigating internal tension. They may appear calm on the surface, but underneath there is often a constant balancing act between wanting connection and fearing what connection might require from them. Because of this, unpredictability can become exhausting. Relationships filled with emotional highs and lows may create excitement, but they also create strain. A partner who remains steady during conflict, who doesn't swing dramatically between closeness and distance, who doesn't turn every difficult moment into a crisis, offers something incredibly valuable: peace. And peace is frequently underestimated because it lacks drama. People remember fireworks. They remember passion, they remember emotional intensity, but long-term relationships are rarely sustained by intensity alone. They are sustained by emotional environments that feel manageable day after day, year after year. The avoidant who once chased excitement often discovers that consistency provides something chemistry never could: relief. This is also why some former partners spend years wondering what happened. They replay memories like investigators studying evidence from an unsolved case. They remember the late-night conversations, the emotional breakthroughs, the moments when the avoidant finally opened up. They remember promises, plans, and vulnerable admissions that felt deeply meaningful. Then they look at the avoidant's future relationship and feel completely confused. How could someone who struggled so much with commitment suddenly appear more settled? How could someone who seemed terrified of intimacy become comfortable sharing a life with someone else? The painful answer is that people often focus on the depth of emotional moments while overlooking the overall emotional experience. An avoidant may have shared extraordinary vulnerability with a previous partner, but if the relationship consistently triggered feelings of pressure, responsibility, or overwhelm, those memories become intertwined with emotional fatigue. Meanwhile, a newer relationship may contain fewer dramatic moments but far more emotional ease. To the outside observer, this seems unfair. To the avoidant's nervous system, it feels sustainable. This doesn't mean the previous relationship lacked meaning. In many cases, it meant more than anyone realizes. But meaning alone doesn't determine who someone builds a future with. The overall emotional atmosphere matters too. And that reality can be incredibly difficult to accept because it challenges the belief that deeper feelings always produce stronger outcomes. Another quality that often surprises people is the importance of acceptance. Many partners enter avoidant relationships with good intentions. They see potential, they see wounds beneath the walls, they see behaviors that could improve with enough love, patience, understanding, or encouragement. None of this comes from a bad place. In fact, it usually comes from genuine care. But somewhere along the way, the relationship can start feeling like a project. Every conversation becomes an opportunity for growth. Every conflict becomes a lesson. Every flaw becomes something to work on. While personal growth is valuable, avoidants can become highly sensitive to feeling managed or evaluated. They may begin sensing that they are constantly being measured against a future version of themselves, a version that is more emotionally available, more expressive, more connected, more open. Even if the intentions are loving, the underlying message can feel difficult to escape. You are not quite enough as you are. The partner who often succeeds with an avoidant isn't necessarily the one who ignores problems. It's the one who creates room for growth without making growth a condition for love. They communicate needs without turning the relationship into a rehabilitation program. They encourage development without treating the avoidant as unfinished. Over time, that acceptance becomes profoundly attractive because it allows the avoidant to relax, and people often become their healthiest selves when they no longer feel pressured to prove their worth. Then there is the subject of space, perhaps the most misunderstood element in the entire avoidant puzzle. To many people, space sounds like distance. It sounds cold. It sounds like emotional separation. But healthy space is something entirely different. Healthy space is breathing room. It is the freedom to process thoughts, emotions, and experiences without feeling rushed. One of the greatest mistakes people make is assuming that more closeness automatically creates more intimacy. In reality, intimacy often requires space to grow. Imagine holding sand in your hand. Squeeze too tightly and it slips through your fingers. Hold it gently and it remains. Relationships can operate the same way. The avoidant who constantly feels pursued may start associating connection with pressure, but when space exists, something interesting happens. They are able to approach rather than defend. They can miss someone rather than escape them. They can move toward connection because it feels voluntary rather than mandatory. This doesn't mean every avoidant responds perfectly to space. Some continue repeating unhealthy patterns. But when an avoidant is capable of a healthy relationship, space often becomes the bridge that allows closeness to exist. The paradox is that the less trapped they feel, the more willing they often become to engage. And ultimately, this leads to the relationship dynamic that tends to last. Not because it is magical, not because it eliminates every problem, but because it balances two needs that often seem impossible to reconcile: the need for connection and the need for autonomy. Many people unconsciously assume relationships require one person to sacrifice themselves for the other. They believe love means constant availability, constant merging, constant emotional fusion, but the healthiest long-term relationships with avoidance rarely look like that. Instead, they are built by two individuals who remain connected without disappearing into each other. They maintain intimacy without abandoning individuality. They support each other without becoming responsible for each other. There is room for closeness, but there is also room for personal identity. There is commitment, but there is also freedom. There is dependence when needed, but not dependency as a lifestyle. This balance doesn't happen accidentally. It requires emotional awareness from both people. It requires trust, it requires confidence, it requires the ability to tolerate temporary discomfort without immediately reacting. But when that balance is achieved, something remarkable happens. The avoidant no longer experiences love as a threat to freedom. Instead, freedom becomes one of the reasons the relationship feels safe enough to stay in, and that is where the story starts to shift in a way that most people never expect. Because the person an avoidant ultimately chooses is often revealing far less about who loved them most and far more about what kind of emotional environment allowed them to become the version of themselves that was finally ready to remain. And that brings us to a truth that changes the entire conversation. Maturity matters more than romance. That statement sounds almost disappointing at first because most people want love stories to be driven by passion. They want grand gestures, undeniable chemistry, and the feeling of being swept away by emotion. But when it comes to who an avoidant actually ends up with, emotional maturity often becomes the deciding factor. Not because romance disappears, but because maturity determines whether romance can survive reality. An emotionally mature person understands that feelings fluctuate. They understand that conflict does not automatically mean rejection. They understand that temporary distance is not always abandonment. They can communicate needs without attacking. They can maintain boundaries without withdrawing love. They can handle uncertainty without creating chaos. To an avoidant, these qualities become incredibly valuable because they reduce the constant fear that intimacy will eventually become overwhelming. The mature partner doesn't require perfection. They don't expect mind reading. They don't turn every emotional challenge into evidence that the relationship is failing. Instead, they create an environment where mistakes can be discussed, differences can exist, and both people can remain human. This is why avoidants often find themselves drawn toward partners who feel emotionally grounded, not because they are boring, not because they lack depth, but because they possess the stability required to build something lasting. The older many avoidants get, the more they begin realizing that emotional maturity creates a sense of safety that chemistry alone never could. And within that maturity lies a trait avoidants often respect more than almost anything else: self-respect. Not arrogance, not ego, not emotional detachment disguised as confidence. Genuine self-respect, the kind that allows someone to love deeply without abandoning themselves. Many people believe sacrifice is the ultimate proof of love. They think giving up their needs, tolerating endless uncertainty, and accepting behavior that hurts them demonstrates devotion. But avoidants often respond differently than expected. When someone repeatedly abandons their own boundaries to keep a relationship alive, the avoidant may not feel more attracted. They may actually feel less secure. Deep down, self-respect signals emotional strength. It communicates that a person values themselves regardless of whether the relationship succeeds or fails. It shows they are choosing the relationship rather than clinging to it. This is important because relationships built on fear often become unstable. Relationships built on choice feel different. The person who can walk away if necessary but stays because they genuinely want to be there creates a unique kind of trust. Ironically, many avoidants respect boundaries far more than endless accommodation. Boundaries create clarity. They create predictability. They establish where one person ends and the other begins. And for someone who fears becoming trapped inside another person's emotional world, that clarity can feel deeply reassuring. But none of this matters unless something changes inside the avoidant themselves. Eventually, many avoidants reach a turning point. Not all of them. Some continue repeating the same patterns for decades, but those who grow often arrive at a painful realization. They begin noticing that the common denominator in their relationship history is not bad luck. It is not always the other person. It is not always poor timing. Sometimes it is the protective strategies they have carried for years. The distancing, the withdrawal, the fear of dependence, the instinct to leave when vulnerability becomes uncomfortable. At first, those strategies may have served a purpose. They may have protected them from pain. They may have helped them survive experiences that felt overwhelming. But over time, the same walls that provided safety start preventing connection. The same defenses that protected them from heartbreak begin blocking intimacy. And eventually, a moment arrives when the cost becomes impossible to ignore. They look back and see opportunities missed, relationships lost, people who genuinely cared but eventually walked away. For the first time, they stop asking how to avoid discomfort and start asking whether avoiding discomfort has been costing them something far more valuable. That realization can become the catalyst for profound change because growth often begins when the pain of staying the same finally exceeds the fear of changing. This is also why commitment looks different when an avoidant is genuinely ready. People often assume readiness means finding the perfect partner. But readiness is less about meeting the right person and more about becoming capable of sustaining the relationship that appears. An avoidant who is ready for commitment doesn't suddenly become a different personality. They don't transform into someone who wants constant closeness or endless emotional discussions. Instead, they become more willing to remain present when discomfort appears. They stop interpreting every challenge as evidence that they need to escape. They become curious about their reactions instead of blindly obeying them. They learn that vulnerability does not automatically lead to catastrophe. They begin understanding that intimacy requires risk from everyone, not just them. Most importantly, they start viewing relationships as places where growth can happen rather than environments they need to control. This shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because once an avoidant becomes willing to stay engaged through moments that previously would have triggered withdrawal, the relationship gains a chance to deepen in ways that were previously impossible. Commitment stops feeling like imprisonment and starts feeling like a conscious choice made repeatedly over time. And now we arrive at the answer hidden inside the title itself. Who does the avoidant actually end up with? Not necessarily the person who loved them the hardest, not necessarily the person who waited the longest, not necessarily the person who sacrificed the most. More often they end up with the person who embodies a combination of qualities that create emotional sustainability. Someone capable of closeness without control. Someone capable of love without self-abandonment. Someone capable of support without becoming responsible for another person's entire emotional world. Someone who respects themselves as much as they respect the relationship. And perhaps most importantly, they often end up with someone who arrives when the avoidant is finally prepared to participate differently. That's the part many people overlook. Timing and readiness matter. A person can be extraordinary and still meet someone before they are capable of receiving what is being offered. The painful reality is that love alone does not determine outcomes. Emotional capacity matters too. So the final lesson is not really about avoidance at all. It is about relationships. It is about the dangerous belief that being chosen is the ultimate measure of worth. So many people spend years asking why they weren't the one an avoidant ended up with, as though the answer will somehow determine their value. But another person's readiness, fears, limitations, and emotional patterns are not a reflection of your worth. The deeper lesson is that healthy love was never supposed to require you to lose yourself in order to earn a place in someone's life. The strongest relationships are not built by one person proving their devotion through endless sacrifice. They are built by two people bringing their full selves into the relationship and choosing each other from a place of wholeness. And when you understand that, something shifts. The question stops being, why did the avoidant choose someone else? And becomes, what kind of relationship allows both people to remain connected without losing themselves? Because in the end, that is the relationship most people are actually searching for. Not one where someone finally chooses them after years of struggle, but one where two healthy individuals can stand side by side, free to leave, free to stay, and continually choose each other anyway.